Welcome to the 30-Year-Old Virgin podcast, where we discuss all things sex, love, and relationships. I'm your host and favorite late bloomer, Allison Cadena, and on today's episode, we are talking about polyamory, something that I'm sure a lot of people have considered and maybe have questions about, especially our late bloomers. It might be something that you've never considered and might be curious. Well, we have an awesome guest who's here to share their experience firsthand. He's a creative strategist and a producer, and like all awesome people, a Queens, New York native. Welcome to the show, JB.
What's going on? Appreciate you having me on.
I'm glad to have you. This show was geared a little bit towards late bloomers, and I imagine that a lot of us haven't even had regular, traditional relationship experiences. So, as I started kind of looking into polyamory, I'm like, this might be something that people are curious about, something that they've never considered, something that they may need. And so I'm just really glad that we could have you on here to talk about how you got into it, what your real experience has been like.
Or even to continue that point as a topic of conversation. Like, I've definitely had those conversations with friends prior to even flirting with the idea. And it's just like, some people are so resolute or fixed in their position on how they approach relationships. Like, I could never, or like, I can't wrap my head around that. So it's just like, you're not even broaching the topic with like, oh, let me make space for how this works. Even if it could be completely outside of the lines in which you normally operate in, you just don't even consider it. So oftentimes it's just like people who move in the poly community are separated from other people's relationships or just interacting with them, and that's not really the best place for reference because there is that difference. So it's interesting. I at least for myself, I would just explore those topics, just like listen to podcasts about it or watch YouTube clips about it, or just listen to my favorite speakers or therapists touch the subject and be like, oh, okay, interesting. It's all new information to me, or I was at one point. For sure.
Right. And kind of like you said, like I feel like for late bloomers, that was part of the idea too, of like late bloomers, we're always talking amongst ourselves, but we don't have the, exposure to other people because it's something you're supposed to be like kind of ashamed of or like not supposed to be, but it's just not as talked about. So these non-traditional kind of relationships, like you said, it's kind of the same. So I do want to, before we go too far, kind of define it, just to make sure we're all on the same page and no one's like, what the hell are they talking about? So just on a baseline, this is obviously more in depth, but on a baseline, polyamory is a form of ethical non-monogamy.
Yes,
and there's a lot of different forms. There's a lot of, it's kind of like malleable to the relationships.
Absolutely.
To the people. But overall, it basically means that the people in these relationships have agreed to a certain amount of freedom to date or be intimate with other people.
Yeah. Very well said.
So you got a little bit into it. You're in a polyamorous relationship now.
Yeah.
Would you be able to kind of tell us like how, I guess you went into a little bit like how you started researching, and tell us a little bit of that journey and then how that kind of plays into the relationship you're in.
So even like to maybe start by backtracking, I've had experience with trying to be in a polyamorous situation. I want to say like 2 years ago. I was like dating someone and she was pansexual, so she liked both men and women, or however people identified. I learned that from her. Just like, I'm like, oh, so you're bisexual? She's like, no, I'm pan. I'm attracted to who I'm attracted to. And I was like, okay, that's cool. And that was a learning curve. So in this current iteration of the person that I'm seeing now, when we met on a dating app. It's a funny story, but we met on a dating app. And then when we went out, she was like, I need to tell you something. I was like, okay. She's like, I have a girlfriend. I was like, oh, word. Okay, that's cool. I'm just like, if you have a girlfriend and you're on a dating app, you're looking still, right? So you must be in an open setup. So that's kind of how the topic was broached. I was okay with it because where I'm at in dating now, I just want to meet people and like have enriching relationships and just experiences. So it's just like, I'm open-minded to that, or I was open to that. So I was like, okay with it. And that was the setup. She was just like, yeah, I have a girlfriend, but she's okay with me dating men. And I was like, okay, that's what's up. And though I don't think, I mean, everyone's experience is unique. For me and for my partner, it was a little rocky at start because there was implications that I thought were clear
Mhm.
that necessarily weren't. I was just like, okay, if you have another person, then it makes sense that I can have another person. So it was just a little unclear at that point. But then having a conversation, having a difficult conversation of just be like, well, this is what I expected and this is what you expected. Where could we meet in the middle?
Mhm.
Is where it worked out. I was just like, okay, maybe that is the case. And like, we can make it malleable to what works for us. And then having conversations about, well, what are boundaries that you would like and what are boundaries that you would expect, right? So it's a difference between like, this is what I would like and this is what I would expect. Because if it's just like, this is how it's supposed to be, it's just like, no one is going to march solely to the beat of your drum.
Mhm.
And then that cuts both ways for me. In my prior experience to that, that was the learning curve where it's just like, okay, well, as a heterosexual man, I'm only attracted to women. Um, like I'm not worried about you and another woman because I'm like attracted to that. That
Right.
works. But she was attracted to both men and women. So it's just like I can't have my cake and eat it too. And like I kind of had to sit there and set those expectations internally.
Mhm.
And for myself, like, okay, well, what if she is interested in another person? I'm just like, at the same time, I could be interested in another person. And then in what capacity? Like, yo, I like to just talk to them. Yo, I like to hang out with them. Yo, I just want to go on a date with them and have a good time. So it's just like learning that there's levers within levers within levers or levels within levels within
Mhm.
levels that you have to just go through and establish and approach it from a place of understanding. Like, oh, that's where you want to draw the line. Why?
Mhm.
Versus like, oh, you draw the line for me there. Nah, that's where you want to draw the line for things that you want to interact with. And it's just like, okay. So just outlining it that way, like as a process as you go along, just going through it and talking about it and seeing where it works for you and where it works for the other person and then meeting in the middle.
Now, you mentioned that like your previous relationship, it kind of opened you up, but this is your first
Yeah.
polyamorous
Yeah. Like
relationship.
we're full on. Like that was just like dating and we were
Mhm.
flirting with the idea and trying to experience it. But like
Mhm.
this is like, no, you're my primary partner.
Mhm.
I'm your primary partner in a sense because she does have someone else that's a woman. So I'm like her primary partner that's a man.
And then did you going into it, you kind of touched on it before, but like what kind of research or like how did, because I would imagine if you hadn't done it before and you knew kind of going into it when you met her that this was something that you'd be kind of signing up for. How
Right.
did you like prepare for that, or where did you go into it just kind of trusting that you wanted to try,
I
or
guess in that moment when she brought it up that she was just like, I have a girlfriend because I have consumed a lot of information. So like that preparing, I necessarily wasn't moving in the world like I'm looking to be in a polyamorous situation at all. For sure, I wasn't.
Mhm.
Though I've had some experience with it, that's not what I was going towards. Like, for example, she didn't have that on her dating profile,
Mhm.
or she didn't have that. It didn't come up in conversation at all. It came up in the moment. But for me, I just consume so much like podcasts or articles, or I follow pages, or I go down YouTube wormholes um, where there are different setups. And
Mhm.
it started way before the word polyamory for me. It was just non-monogamish,
Mhm.
non-monogamy or monogamish. And I think that was Dan Savage. I
Mhm.
think I heard that word from him first. Um, that I've just heard about other people's experiences, especially in like the traditional monogamy sense, like marriages that were together for 10, 15, 20 plus years. And then all of a sudden, the wife was like, I want to try bringing other people into the bedroom. So I'm sitting here like, this is a very exciting episode. Like, I would just listen to these episodes and like just be bought in and be like, oh, it made me understand a little more of people's reasoning. One of the ones for sure, one of my favorite podcasts, they're no longer up. It's called Dear Sugars. and they introduced me to one of my favorite psychotherapists, Esther Perel. And
Love
like,
her.
yeah, she's amazing. Honestly, the woman's work has changed my life. And that episode, it was an episode about like infidelity and cheating.
Mhm.
And that's how I like Esther was a guest, and like she talked about it because she talks about like non-monogamy or non-traditional setup. So I would just consume a lot of that information. So I'm just open to more variations of situations. Um, and that's what was just like, okay, so if you have another person, that means you're just open to receiving from different people. And when I heard those terms in the past, I was like, I'm interested in that. Like I
Mhm.
could see myself, it kind of formulated a category in my brain and in my emotional intelligence to say that fits what you've felt before, but before you weren't able to categorize it. Before it was within the confines of traditional monogamy, where it's just like, well, why do you want to have so many friends of the opposite gender? Or why do you want to develop new friendships when you're
Mhm.
already in a healthy, loving relationships? Like, what are you out there seeking?
Mhm.
And before I'd be like, I don't know. I just am. I'm attracted to other people. I'm attracted to new connections. And like we were talking about before, where your reference is maybe your immediate sphere of influence or the just the world in which you move in traditionally, and
The
there's no place, the
standards.
standards, there's
Yep.
no place to just recognize that maybe you feel that or you feel something adjacent to that. So I had just by my own curiosity consumed a lot of just episodes and articles and conversations about that stuff. So I'm like, okay, I'm floating somewhere in that space.
Mhm.
My understanding is a little more nuanced because of that space of just relationships and relationship stuff in general too. Um, so when it came up, I was just like, okay, I'm a little open to how this could play out because I understand that these things exist and understand that they work and understand that the traditional setup for me has always been a little too rigid,
Mhm.
and I'm willing to move in this direction and explore.
Right. And so I would imagine, so in a traditional monogamous relationship, right? You're dating most people. You say it's safe to like date other people in the early stages, and then there's a point where you have that conversation of like, oh, are we going to be exclusive? And I'm wondering, what does that kind of look like in a non-traditional relationship where like there's not really exclusivity. It's more like, I mean, you kind of mentioned that there was a conversation about like what the boundaries were,
Hmm.
but I'm just wondering what does that look like in terms of pacing or in terms of like having that
For sure.
conversation?
Um, and I also have like a couple of friends who I could talk to about this stuff
Mhm.
that are a little more receptive to it. Um, and I would say that the pacing and like how that came up, everyone's situation is different. I think what I'm learning is that seeking to at least establish that baseline is probably the best way, the most healthiest way. For me and my partner, it didn't necessarily play out like that because it's like what you expect or versus what you think is implied. The other
Mhm.
person might not be on the same page.
Mhm.
Um, so it kind of just played out as just like, well, this is what I thought we were doing because this is what I thought you were doing, right? You
Mhm.
have your person that you can be with, and then that leaves me open to also have other people. And it doesn't really necessarily say anything more or less than about what we are developing.
Mhm.
Um, so it was just a very nuanced conversation that like kind of one step forward, maybe two steps back.
Mhm.
Like, okay, maybe that's how I felt good about that or didn't feel good about that. So we're just kind of figuring it out as we go.
Mhm.
But being very mindful of like wanting to understand. Um, because no one is gonna get it right 100% of the time.
Mhm.
So it's just like, yo, you did that, and like I didn't like that. But
Right.
like, and maybe if you tell me why you wanted to go out on a date with a person or wanted to spend time with a person, or like didn't tell me versus like you already did it. This should mean something, and it's just
Mm.
like, nah, I didn't know that that was gonna bother you, or I didn't know that
Right.
that was gonna cause an issue. So it's just seeking that while also developing a relationship. So it's just like a lot of figuring out as you go along
Mhm.
and just wanting to approach it with understanding, because at the end of the day, it's just like, hey, I like you, I care about you, I want to invest time in you, I like what we feel and what we have going on. But I know that that's not the only thing. So it's just like kind of letting that create, like letting that live in its own bubble, but being mindful that like other things come up in life. Like you might meet someone, or you might all of a sudden might have a new person in your life through work or through some other situation where just like, oh, you are just attracted. And attracted doesn't necessarily have to mean in just a physical sense. Like you could just be attracted to that person. You might just want to get to know that person. You might just want to talk to them. And it also works retroactively. You have people in your past that you're still super cool with, that you might have history with, that they may still mean something to you. And it's just like in a traditional setup, sometimes that like goes out the window. Like, what do you
in a
mean?
traditional setup, it's like no and no
Yeah.
and no.
Right. It's a lot more
Yeah.
that. It's a lot more like, nah, I would never, or nah,
Mhm.
I could never see how that fits. But we all have experiences, especially as individuals who are blooming late into their space in relationships. It's like we all have some type of past, or we have to be mindful that the person that we meet has a past, and it's
Mhm.
complicated and it's nuanced. So it's just like making space for that understanding.
Right. And so your partner already had an existing situation.
Yeah.
Were any of the conversations, did they include that other person, or was it kind of like just between the two of you and like they figured
Right.
their
So
interactions out
so
themselves?
like for her and her partner, um they had those conversations
Mhm.
themselves. And for me, I just kind of wanted to focus on me and my primary person.
Mhm.
Like, I'll be very honest, it's tricky because like on paper it's great. Like, okay, this is a kind of an open setup. Like there's space to do a lot, but I wanted to, for any kind of relationship, solidify what was going on between us. So it's
Mhm.
just like, look, what you and her do or have has no real bearing on what you and I are looking to build.
Right.
And I'm looking to give you that space individually. And um, she kind of was just like, okay, I
Right.
see, like we can focus on what's here, and you're not threatened by what I have with someone else,
Mhm.
because that other situation has its own dynamics and has its own, just its own criteria to be met or not be met, or all these other
Mhm.
things. I was just like, yeah, it has nothing to do with that.
Yeah. It's almost like you allow her to handle that
Allow is,
relationship,
yeah, but
but
yes, like I guess I give the grace to like handle it as you will. And
Mhm.
if anything, like I want to be there for you if you have an issue with that. And for me, it's just like, okay, so if you have an issue with the other person, I'm interested in how you handle this and how you talk
Mhm.
about it and how you want to feel about it, how you want to express it. And I think it is a very beautiful moment when you can do that with a person you're with, and them not like sit there and judge you or think, you think with the ego.
Mhm.
Like I don't approach it with it like the JB ego first processing. It's like not a filter. It's like,
Mhm.
nah, I'm gonna remove that and just let you tell me how you feel and how you process and how you're dealing with that. And then I go, okay.
Mhm.
A lot of how does that make you feel? A lot of like just being there and wanting to understand. And then it's just like, okay, I'm processing that. Cool. And just giving feedback, my feedback very unfiltered and raw.
Mhm.
Be like, yo, I wouldn't do that. And then the other person goes, oh, okay, you wouldn't? Nah, it's like I wouldn't approach it that way. It's like, oh,
Mhm.
I could see how you would think. It's just making just the an even playing field
Right.
for all those just thoughts to come up
I
and
think
talk about them.
I think it's interesting because it reminds me of like when you're in a relationship and you're talking about like something that happened at work, or let's say like something that happened with a friend, and you have that person to kind of spitball it with, but at the same time you can then take that for yourself as like a learning, because you're kind of like in the same situation of like you guys are working out your relationship and then we are also working it out. So I think it's almost kind of cool, like you have like a little bit of insight, like
Yeah.
you don't gotta
And
fuck it
and
up, let
and
somebody
and
else fuck it
and
up.
even like insight for myself, like it's kind of like a sounding board.
Mhm.
Like you have a person that could be your sounding board for things and not take things personal. Like sometimes we just are always so mindful of like all right, I'm gonna speak from the heart, but what are they really gonna say, or what are they really gonna think? And I can only speak as a man. Like, if I say this about a woman to a woman,
Mhm.
they're gonna process it through like this filter of like, oh, what is it? Like any preconceived notions.
Mhm.
And I just think it for me, it's helped clear up that space where it's like that's not true, because we at least have uh said that this is for us, in between you and I, this is what we're gonna work on actively. Like, set the intention
Mhm.
to want to be understanding for each other, want to be there for each other. So anything else could kind of come and go, because you know that it's not gonna get filtered through this like, did you really mean that? Or like, what are these, like, not preconceived notions, or like any agendas that are there. And honestly, as a guy, like that preconceived notion of like, oh, he's just trying to fuck or get in my pants or like do something, it's just like, it's not. It's just, if I could already do that under our terms, like, why am I gonna have to omit or hide or say anything?
Right.
Like, yeah, I have a crush on her, or yeah, she's cute, or she's
Mhm.
attractive, or like, oh my god, there's this new girl at work who's, I just like her. But we also have this work situation where I have to like be assertive with her, or I have to let her be my boss, or you know what I mean? Where it's like,
Mhm.
I don't have to worry about that filter, like, oh man, what is my person gonna think? Because I like kind of am attracted to this new person that's come into my life, whether work or social group or something.
Right.
And you could get to the root of like how you interact with that person.
Mhm. Does jealousy ever come up? Because I would imagine, I mean, at least in traditional monogamous relationships, obviously depending on who you're dating, like sometimes that could be really jealousy inducing just to people. If you were to tell me like, oh, it could be as simple as there's a new girl at work. It don't even have to be that you're attracted to them. There's a new girl at work, and for some people that's like, whoa, now why is there a new girl?
Well, for sure, jealousy is definitely a real thing.
Mhm.
Like, I'm gonna say this: I'm not a jealous person.
Mhm.
I'm not a possessive person. Like, very much not jealous. However, it's still a thing. Like, you can be jealous. It's just, again, for me, it's how I relate to that jealousy. Like, am I jealous that this person now has access to you? Like, oh, you have a new coworker, they're gonna spend more time with you. So it's just like, what am I really jealous of? Am I jealous of them? Or am I jealous of the fact that your time is now, you can spend it with someone else? And what is that telling me? Like, oh, maybe
Mhm.
I want to spend more time with you. Or am I jealous that you're attracted to something that they have physically? Are they taller? Are they thinner? Are they more like, what is that telling me? Is that something that I wish you were attracted to about me? So that's just my reference to how jealousy comes up. And
Mhm.
I could say those things, and I could talk about those things without necessarily feeling some ego or like shame,
Mhm.
because I have a space to be like, "Oh, okay, this is why I felt maybe jealousy for that. And I'm telling you, like, this is what came up for me."
Yeah.
And then it's just like, okay, it doesn't have to necessarily live in jealousy in a traditional sense. Like, I'm jealous, what you're getting. It's just like, no, you're just feeling that.
Mhm.
And it's just a reflection of your thoughts and where do you want to place it. And then the other person is mindful of it. Like, okay, so that's what you're feeling. Okay, that's what's coming up for you. Now I
Mhm.
could be a little more sensitive and tell you about it, or be mindful that maybe you do want to hear about that, or you don't want to hear about that. That, oh, I'm working again with such and such,
Mhm.
or oh, I was around such and such.
That's I find that so interesting because I think sometimes, especially like with things like jealousy and stuff, like there is like a deeper root. And sometimes you don't get to it because it's easier to just be like, like shut
Right.
it down. Like don't
Because
be
it's
around her.
looked
I
at
don't
as
like
a
her,
bad thing.
Yeah.
Like, jealousy is looked at as a bad thing. Like,
Mhm.
oh, you're jealous. And maybe I shouldn't say jealousy is looked at as a bad thing, because someone else that like I dated recently, and I told her, I was like, I'm not a jealous person. And she's like, yo, that's what bothers me. She's just like, that's what I can't see taking you serious.
Mhm.
And she said this to me, and she's just like, yeah, I'm used to my men being traditionally jealous and like low key machismo, or like some level
Mhm.
of toxic masculinity. And I'm like, that's not me.
Yeah.
Like, I'm a full blown ass feminist. And I say that because I realize that my thinking doesn't align with a lot of other stuff,
Mhm.
jealousy or all these possessive types of ideas. And she was just like, yeah, I like you, but you're not in the mold in which I'm used to. And I was like, all right, that's cool. And then like as some time went on, she's just like, now I don't know if, she's like, because of my interactions with you, she's like, now I don't know if I like jealous
Jealous
men.
people.
I guess
Yeah.
for her, it was like jealousy is a sign of you only want me, you only have eyes for me, you
It's like a
only a
validation.
validation. Thank you. It's just like you validate that because you're, and I'm like, nah, I could validate you in 100 other ways, and at the same time be like, did your crush show up at work today? Like, what was he wearing? Like, it's like because maybe if that gives you something, because for me also like channeling that energy, like channeling that jealous, let's just say, energy, and repurposing it and bringing into relationships and making them a point of like a starting point for something better in the relationship.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I'm like, I'm a nerd for like healing and trauma. So the idea that you can like literally work through like why am I jealous and like being forced to because now you need to explain it and find the boundaries with another person. Like I'm
Yeah.
like, "Psh, that's cool. um, but so um, we talked a little bit about like pacing and how that works, and I'm just wondering, and again, I'm very ignorant to non-monogamous relationships. I would think if you've been with a person for a certain amount of time and you're thinking of, let's say, marriage, I don't know if that's something that would even come into play for polyamorous people. Is there a point where you would consider closing off the relationship and just exclusively dating the two of you, or kind of how do you see that in terms of like advancing the relationship when you're further along and it's like really something serious for your future?
No, that's a great question. I haven't necessarily thought about it, but I do know where my stance is in life about just dating and like meeting people in general. So I think prior to the person that I'm with now that I've been with for a little while, I was going into dates just claiming like this is where I stand on things. This is where I stand on my relationships with women. This is where I stand on just dynamics in general, or dating dynamics, or marriage, or kids. Like all these things kind of come up whether when you first start talking or you go on a date or two, like especially sometimes, again, can only speak from my experience, women will be like, so how do you feel about dating, kids, and all these things? Like
Right.
they want to clear. Some people have that more defined, and I've realized that I don't have that so defined because of the lifestyles that I want to live in, like with my career or with my personal dynamics or even with my family dynamics. I'm just like, I don't subscribe to that. I've tried, or I feel like I'm just opening myself up to other things. So to address the question, is just like moving down the line, I'm like, I don't know if I see a traditional setup being something I can envision. It doesn't limit how I want to approach romantic partnerships. But if it's like meeting a person, they're like, nah, I need to have kids. I'm just like, well, I don't know if I want to, if I can envision that lifestyle right now, because I want to travel for work, or I'm currently working on getting my life into this rhythm that just doesn't fit in it. I don't close myself off to it. I think I'm old enough to not be naive and be like, nah, never say never. Like, never gonna happen. It's like, nah, could happen. And also, I'm a guy. Like, I could have kids at,
Any age, you don't have
I'm
that
33.
pressure.
Like, so I'm like mindful for that, and going back to like other conversations that I've heard on podcasts or in conversations in videos and things like that, where it's just like, oh damn, I never had really, like, I had thought about it, but had never set in when you hear a woman say, yeah, because of the pressure on a biological clock or on a societal timeline. Like, nah, I had never thought about that. So I'm a little more understanding if I meet a person and they're like, nah, I need to have kids within the next 5 years. I'm like, oh, I can't meet you there. I could like you, we could be hitting it off. I can't meet you there. Or like, oh, down the line, is our relationship going to be closed off? It's like, well, I don't know. The lifestyle that I'm trying to live right now, it would be difficult. It would be a lot of work. So it leaves the question, not necessarily definitively yes or no, but it's like, this is my perspective and this is my point on it. So it's just like, would we close off our relationship? I think the conversation that point would be included in a conversation that's more well-rounded. Like, well, where are you at with work? Where are you at with family? Where are you at with your health? Where are you at, like, with all these other goals? Where does a relationship fit in that? Like, a relationship is not the determining and driving factor for it. And now if that just comes up in conversation, it's just like, okay, well, what if you need to move somewhere? Then it'd be like, oh, well, I value the relationship for this, that, and the third. So it's very nuanced, very like situation by situation, like, and going with it along those lines. But if the person is just like, this is what I want, it's just like we've said, talk about it. How can I meet you halfway for that? Or how can you understand why I want to say yes or no?
I feel like you guys have such an advantage in the fact that you have to have that open communication about things, that like you're not afraid to have the difficult conversations.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Like, and I was also in a long-term relationship for like 5+ years with someone, traditional monogamy setup. Like, we cohabitated, and it's just a lot of those conversations are so difficult because there's all this pressure of like what we've done, where we're going, what we're supposed to be doing. And for me, I look back at that now and I'm like, man, I didn't have the toolkit emotionally to like place how I felt in all those different ways. I was just working within the confines of what something was before.
Right, like the expectations of what people.
So it was just so
think it's
difficult to
supposed to be.
have a difficult conversation because it's like, we're going to have this conversation and we got to get to a resolution by the end of it. Now it's just like we have conversations that are difficult and we can pick them up, put them down, revisit them, dwell on them, try to just see it solely from another person's point of view, try it from another person's point of view. Like, all right, I'll try that. But like, yo, it's not working. Like, I can't see myself thinking this way.
Right. So you kind of touched on it as well, of like how does polyamory compare to the monogamous relationships that you had before that? Like, is there? Well, I guess this is like, since you're in a relationship, it's kind of a weird question to ask, but like, is this something that you see is more fitting for your lifestyle? That you're like, yeah, I think this is kind of how I want to move forward in general, even if this doesn't work out, or
Yeah, for right now, yes. Like, compared to what I have experienced in the past, I think it fits my lifestyle more and it fits my personality a little more. Like, I love meeting new people. I love interactions. And like when I find myself doing creative work or networking or just solidify, I just like connections.
yeah,
And connections are a very important part of my lifestyle. I have to work with people in high stress environments. I have to develop a workflow with people, and tap into like a rich creative vein. Or even on the producer side, like I have to develop a very like, I can count on you. This is the expectations. I can understand everything that's going on in your life, but you could leave that at the door. Like, we got to get stuff done. Like, we in production mode. You know what I mean? Like, once it's go time, it's go time. So just compartmentalizing things. So I feel like in a traditional monogamous setup, there's just a little more rigid. And I struggled with that because my lifestyle, or as my career was developing, or as just the experiences that I was gravitating towards called me, it like drew me away from the traditional setup. And again, at the time I didn't know, so I felt like I was doing something wrong. And now I feel like I'm just so empowered. So I feel like I'm operating from such a better place. And I have a person that's like wanting the best for me and like happy for me if things are going in a new direction. And at the same time, they're operating from like the reassurance and the knowing that like none of that is going to take away from her. And before, it was just like, if I did something, I'm like, oh man, is my person going to feel like that's taking away from them?
right.
Like, I feel like I've always just had a lot of love to give, and love has different forms. And sometimes it would be like, why do you need a new friend? Who is this new person? Why are you so excited about talking to this person? I'd be like, I don't know how to explain that. And
Right.
now it's just like, oh, that's cool. Who are they?
That's awesome. So it's like there's more, almost not independence, but like there's me, there's you, and then there's us, as opposed to like we have to kind of, everything is like meshed into one.
Because also in like, and these conversations come up in like those early dating like conversations, where it's just like, what role does a partnership or a relationship play for you? Like some people are all about their relationships, right? Some people like get into a relationship and their friendships suffer,
Right.
or their family life suffer, or
The
their
career.
work balance life suffers. Like for me, because I wanted to develop into like just in an industry where there's a lot of connections, it's a lot of non-traditional hours, right? Like there'd be events on Tuesday, Wednesdays, Thursdays,
Or you're
or you're
traveling.
traveling. Yeah, so it's just like a lot of those things forced me away from what a traditional relationship setup would be like. Or if the event is on a Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, like those are my work. Like I'm on pre-production mode all week, and then on the weekend when you have your free time, it's like, nah, that's my time where I'm supposed to be working. So it's just making like people understanding that. So when those conversations come up and how I relate to my relationship or what value or purposes it play in my life, it's in a non-traditional way. So it's just like, okay, this is the way I look at things. And some people are like, nah, what do you mean you work on Saturdays and Sundays? Like that's supposed to be our time. That's supposed to be date nights. And it's just like, oh, it's not gonna work.
Yeah.
That's not gonna suit me. So
So obviously you went into it with a level of understanding of kind of what you were getting into. But is there anything that you wish you had known before getting into a polyamorous relationship that maybe you learned along the way and you're like, somebody should have told me that at the beginning?
That's a good question. I mean, things have been really good so far. Um, I think the experience that I had of like how to prepare for that is just like you may think you know how you're gonna emotionally react in that moment, but your emotions just come up and they bubble up, like just how that feeling is. And it's hard to say like I wish I would have known, someone would have prepared me for that, but you can't. You can't
Until
prepare
you've
for
gone
someone
through it.
until you've gone through it,
Mhm.
right? And I think I've just been lucky enough to know to just prepare myself or try to prepare myself or condition myself to thinking like when that moment comes up, remember where you're trying to go or what you're trying to do. Because I'm like, I may be on the receiving end of some new information or new experience, but I could also be the one causing that for someone else. And when you cause someone else maybe discomfort or pain, you feel bad. And then you have like this wave of guilt, like, oh my God, that's not what I intended. So it's just like, yo, sometimes you're on the receiving end, sometimes you're the one, I guess, inducing that feeling in another person. Um, and that's hard to say. I wish someone prepared me for that because there's really no preparing for it. Like
Right.
sometimes it's just like, oh, word, you had an experience with another person that like I'm excited for you. And then sometimes it's just like you're like that meme where the guy's just blinking. You're like, oh, oh. And then I catch myself like, okay, but, and I get to ask all the questions. Like I don't have to hold anything back in my thinking. It's just like, well, what, when, where, why, how. It's just a lot of over communication.
Yeah.
Honestly, every circumstance is just a lot of over communication.
And almost like you can't be afraid of the emotional part. That's what it sounds like. Because like even, I mean, you talked about it with jealousy and stuff, but it's like, okay, that's the emotion. Let's explore it. You can't be afraid to like address it because that's part of the conversation. It's like an
Right.
important part of the
And
conversation.
in traditional setups, sometimes like I felt like there's no space for that. Like for the man or the woman or whomever, it's just like, oh, you were bothered by something. And it's just like a lot of those, no, forget it. Tell me what that is, because that's going to fester.
Yeah.
And you may not think that's going to affect me or us, but it might. It could. For all we know, it is. So is that like, no, forget it. And you like look away. It's like, no, no, no. You might not have to tell me right now, but like, let's revisit that. And then at the same time, I say that, oh, no, forget it. And it's like, wait. What were you brushing off? And it's like, oh, actually, this is what I was thinking. And they're like, oh, okay. I didn't know that. It's just a lot of over communication.
And I feel like that probably even fosters like deeper connections too.
Yeah.
Because like you really have to go there with your partner.
Yeah. There's I forgot who said it, but like I think I was watching something from Bumble. They had like this series of talks. I think it was Jadena that they had on. And I had heard it before, but he was someone that that talked about this practice. Like when you have a check-in with your partner, do it naked. like sit down, lay in bed, whatever, do it naked, hold hands, let your feet touch your because you're in a super vulnerable state in that
Mhm.
moment, right? It's like pillow talk. Like
Mhm.
sometimes it's much easier to say something to someone while you're playing with their hair versus when you're out at dinner and the ride in was a little tense because there was traffic and there was
Mm.
parking. And now you want to bring something up that's been festering inside you. But when you're in a very vulnerable place, right? When you butt naked, you don't got pockets to put your hands in, or you don't got
Mhm.
your phone to check and like deflect, you can express that vulnerability with that person. And then they're like, oh, okay, that took a lot for you to say, but like I can physically reassure you here, or I could be, it's just literally just us and the way we were brought into this world to be there for a person.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, I mean, you obviously do. You mentioned that you've gone listened to podcasts. You're kind of like learning about this as well. For someone who's just starting and getting interested in possibly pursuing polyamory, is there anything that you could recommend? I know you mentioned that there's kind of like a community as well.
I say like just do that deep work with yourself and ask you those questions. Like what I did is just reflect on prior experiences
Mhm.
and it how I started. Like I didn't necessarily go out seeking polyamory information or just yeah educating myself on that. But it was just listening to a lot of content about people and their nuanced relationships, relationships coming out to their parents or people coming out to their spouses.
Mhm.
Like when I sit there and I'm like, wow, this person was in a loving relationship with kids for 20, 30 years, and then they came out to their spouse. I'm like, I learned to hold space for that kind of information, though that would have never been my experience or never would have been my experience for my immediate friends because we didn't move in that world. But because I opened myself up to, I think because I opened myself up to a lot of those stories, just like, damn, I'm sitting there folding my laundry and I just stop like, yo, I'm feeling for this person. It's just a
Yeah.
lot of empathy. And you just teach me to have a lot more empathy. So it's just like do inner work and then try to consume stuff that can teach you how to have empathy in new ways or to teach you even to sympathize. Right? Like, right. If it's like, yo, I could never be in that situation, but like those situations exist. People go through that.
Mhm.
And like I kind of just stop and hold space for them. That's what I would do. And then also friends for sure. Like I have a friend who at the same time was like considering polyamory or non-monogamous relationships, and we would have a lot of conversations about stuff and just like talk and talk and talk and she's a woman, so it's just like I get her perspective and then I'd be like, oh no, and then like then we would talk about stuff and be like, man, that conversation went down this rabbit hole, like maybe like something polyamory, and then we start to send each other, like I would find pages because you know the For You page be listening.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? The algorithm be algorithming.
Right.
So like, oh, this came up on my feed. And then I'd feel like normally I'm like, damn, I can't send that to the homies. I'd be like, bro, why are you sending me this? Like, what are you, right? Or
Mhm.
like send it to some other friends that I maybe never had that conversation with, but then I could send it to a friend that's just like, remember that thing we were talking about? Like, look at this. And it's like, oh, word. And then she would send me stuff. And then we kind of be there for each other. Like, yeah, I also am exploring these ideas too. Just look for support as you're
Mhm.
doing that for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I can't relate for polyamory specifically, but I know they have like late bloomer Facebook groups, or when I had like weight loss surgery, they had groups for people who also went through it. So I would imagine that there's probably things like that as well, where you
Yeah,
can
for
ask
sure.
the questions that you want to ask
For
in kind of
sure.
a safe space.
Especially for polyamory, a lot of it is just like welcoming.
Mhm.
It's just like, yeah, seek with understanding. Like, we're
Mhm.
going to welcome you even if you want to dip your toe in the water because, like, it starts with like non monogamy or
Mhm.
monogamish, where it's just like, well, you're finding out what it works, like, what works for you. Some people want to dive in the deep end, some people just want to take a look, a
Mhm.
cursory look. So there's definitely a lot of that and leaning into that because those people are going to be receptive.
Yeah.
And for another, like for me personally, is also just engaging with a lot of the LGBTQ community. Like as a straight guy, I like stopped and I was just telling my homegirl this, like I stopped and realized like I didn't have that many gay friends.
Mhm.
So I'm like, damn, I'm limiting my knowledge base of tangible or like close proximity experience to a lot of different things, because people in the LGBTQ community are always looking to be open and accepting, because they need that to just exist in this world.
And by nature, they're in
know,
non-traditional
right? So like
relationships.
they operate from that place. And I'm like, I've always said that I would die for gay rights, because that's just human rights.
Mhm.
Like I can't just act like we need to have all these civil, points met in society, and then you exclude people who like you said, live that, like embody that just by waking up every day, or just by presenting to the world every day. So that community and conversations with people helped a lot, because I'm like, oh damn, y'all go through a whole bunch of other stuff that I never would have thought about unless I had a conversation with you. So then I could bring particular instances to them, and they're like, yeah, I get that, like, oh, for sure. And then you just say like, oh man, it's cool. I could talk and listen.
Yeah, and feel open to do that, because you're coming to a place that's like a little more, like you said, open to those kinds of different experiences.
And they just listen. And like, if I'm telling some of the homies, they're going to jump with these preconceived notions and questions before they listen in. Like, they just like, but what about, and I'm just like, just process for a second. Just hear it out. Don't throw all these other what if scenarios first.
Well, we had a guest in our first episode that she's a therapist, and she said that a lot of time people are coming with their own biases of like their experience or their values or whatever, and so it's almost like they're shut off to even have those conversations. And they could be the most logical people in the world, but
they might not be aware of it.
Yeah.
They just have that like instant like and just react.
Like they just cut it like at a certain point from where they're coming from,
their vantage point, their perspective, their lived experience. So that to me was just huge too. And like, again, I fancy myself a feminist. I like try to consume a lot of perspectives from that, like lived experiences that I could never have, because I'm never going to be able to have an even remotely similar experience. Like we're saying, that aha moment for me where it's just like, yeah, I guess I could have a kid. Like I don't think about that in a way of like my clock is ticking.
Right.
So a lot of those conversations and perspectives and vantage points that I have from a woman's perspective, I like try to place more front and center, because I've just operated in the world as a man for so long, and I'm just used to the way I process the world as a man. Like I've had conversations, and one that I always talk about that like literally blew my mind was my homegirl telling me one day like, yo, I never let an Uber drop me off like right in front of my crib, or like if someone gives me a ride, like they never come straight to my house. I'm like, why the fuck not? She's like, because he could be a serial killer, or they could be a serial killer. And I'm like, damn, I don't move in the world afraid.
Yeah.
So I'm like, there's different ways to look at this. Like I never was just, or like, yo, you went out for a run at night. That must be nice. And I'm like, why? It's cooler at night. You're like, yeah, but you could get dragged into the bushes.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, by whom?
Yeah.
She's like, by anything. And I'm like, nah, I wasn't thinking about it like that.
Yeah. I saw a TikTok where someone was like upset because they were talking to someone on a dating app for like a week. And then the person said when they wanted to suggest a date, the guy asked like, oh, what do you want to do? And she's like, oh, you suggest something. Like she was very traditional. It's like the guy had to pick the date, and he said, oh, well, do you want to go to this like hiking trail, whatever? And she was like, oh, horrified. How can he take me to a hiking trail? And I'm like, because he doesn't know. He's probably thinking it's daytime.
Straight up. Straight up. Even like if I go on a date with a woman, I'll be like, yo, I appreciate you coming alone. Like if a shorty to me is just like, yo, we can hang out the first time, but in a group setting, or like I'm gonna bring my homegirl, like bring friends because I don't know you. I'd be like, I get that, because shit happens. Like we've all heard horror stories. It's just like as a guy, you don't like. I told like when I met the person I'm with now, I was with my homies. We went to some function. She lived close, so I was like, yo, this is what I'm doing tonight. Like we could link up here, and then like afterwards we could go do our own thing. She was like, all right, cool. And she pulled up, and I like was with my friends. So I got the ride, whatever. I was chilling. I was in a good environment. She pulled up alone. And I was just like, oh, word. Yeah, I appreciate you pulling up alone. She's like, oh, don't worry. My friends have my location. They know what you look like. They have your phone number. They have your social media. And I'm just like,
you are traceable, sir.
yeah. And I'm like, I ain't tell my friends anything. I just say, yo, I'm pulling up. I'm about to link with someone.
Yeah.
We just move differently in the world.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? But I'm mindful of that. Like if she would have, like I didn't take offense to that. Like, oh, why do your friends need to know my phone number and what I look like and have my, like your location?
Mhm.
Like I'm not threatened by that because I'm like, nah, I've unfortunately heard crazy instances where,
Mhm.
you know, a woman went on a date alone and then she ain't come home. That's just the world that they live in. And it's not the world that I operate in or operate from. So I'm like, nah, like I get that. So it's just like that person saying like, oh, a trail, a hike. He's not thinking like, yo, she might think I'm gonna kidnap her. It's just like, but for her, that's like where she's operating from.
Right. I think one thing that I really learned in this episode is like, not that I didn't know much about polyamory. I wouldn't say that it had like a bad connotation to it, but I think where a lot of people may see it as like kind of like crass or like, have a negative opinion of it. I think it's very clear that to be in that kind of setup, there has to be a level of like maturity, empathy, like even in this conversation of like kind of, I feel like you have to almost be at a higher level of like enlightenment and understanding to operate like that. Cause like you
I
said,
appreciate that. And I think it comes from, like I said, just
Mm-hmm.
consuming so much content of like people going through all sorts of stuff, not just relationship stuff, just life stuff. And I just sit there and it helped me in moments when I was down or depressed or questioning myself of like how I'm moving with people, how I'm making people feel. And you feel this guilt where it's just like you hear other people go through heavier stuff, especially people at like later stages in life. That was for me where it's just like, yo, I'm going through a situation with someone that I was with in my 20s or like whatever, or my early 30s. There's people who are out here in their 50s and their 60s with kids, refiguring out who they are in this world. And it's just like, give the grace to accept that that happens to people and people operate from that. You know what I mean? We're in the most progressive time in human history. You know what I mean? There's just people who are stepping out into new iterations of themselves or just new communities or just all new experiences. It's just like, it's just the beginning for that. I mean, gay marriage was legalized in my lifetime. You know what I mean? Like our parents' generation or our grandparents' generation, that is a foreign concept to them. But if we have kids or younger people, it's just like, yeah, that's the norm. So it's just like understanding that there can be that other level of like enlightenment, but you have to seek it. Because if not, it could catch up to you. I mean, like, not to hark back to like the whole feminist thing, but like I like those kind of conversations. I challenge a lot of my friends, a lot of my guy friends with those conversations when it's just like they hit you with the oh, not my person or not my woman could do that. But for their sister or their mother, they want that, but not the person they choose to be with. And it's just like, really? So you just like, it's just, you have all these caveats to things and that's not how life works.
Right.
You know what I mean? What are you going to do when your sister or your mother says, boom, I have this other point of view for life? And then what? Your world is going to be shattered and you have to either rise to that and meet them because you want to operate from a place of love, or you're just going to go in the other direction and just be like, nah, I refute how you experience the world. It's like, it's not going to get you anywhere in life.
Right.
If you put blinders on and just say no.
We're getting to the end of the podcast, but I really want to thank you because I think for me, especially coming into it, I had Googled and tried to educate myself a bit about it. But I think hearing from you is like a lot more telling and like a real like human experience of it. So I'm like really glad that we got to have this conversation.
I appreciate it. That's why I was like, yeah, I'm with it.
Yeah, I'm so glad you did.
Talk about this.
And so I hope it was educational for everyone else listening, whether you're considering polyamory or not. Just like maybe don't take everything at face value. Be open to different types of experiences and figure out what works for you.
Lean into that.
Yeah.
Like lean into it, because if not, you're just stopping yourself. I think that's my thing. Like, I'm all for the experience. you're scared of it, cool, but it don't gotta be on anyone else's timeline. Just lean into it how you find yourself, and life will kind of mirror what you put into it.
Love that. So thank you again, JB, for sharing your experience with us. If you liked what you heard, make sure to subscribe, and we'll be back next week for another episode of the 30-Year-Old Virgin Podcast.